Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I hope you all had a really good evening, enjoying Porto and your free evening last night. We're going to get on to our presentations very, very soon, but as usual, there's just a few announcements to give you. A reminder that tonight is the gala dinner. It's at the really beautiful Taylor's Port Wine House. Please remember to bring your badges with you, and if you're a guest or another participant, bring your purchase ticket with you. There is a bus schedule that's gone out by email. Please check that. It tells you where all the buses are departing from and when they will return and to which hotels. That's also online on the website, so you can find it there, but do check that out. To follow up on that, I'm pleased to say and remind you that tomorrow morning all sessions will start 30 minutes later, so you get a bit of a lie-in tomorrow after the gala dinner. And we start with coffee downstairs, so do join us for coffee first before the sessions start. We have another busy day today. Please do take time to go down and look at the posters on the ground floor. And during every break, there are demonstrations in the demonstration area, which is downstairs in the lunch area. So please do go and enjoy those. And finally, just to remind you again that please do fill in your feedback. It helps us improve TNC every year. So I'm really excited about the session today. I think we've got two really, really good speakers for you. But when I was asked to chair this session, I had quite a hard time thinking about the hook between the two presentations. I think we've got adversity and diversity, but they don't really go together and they're not very good natural bedfellows. But I think there is a hook between them and there is a link, and I think that link is the human factor. So in both of our presentations, the technology that we were talking about is really secondary to very, very specific human needs. Firstly, in times of disaster response, and secondly, in our everyday lives working. I'm very pleased to say that our first speaker is Timo Lug. Timo started his career as a journalist in Germany, but he now runs his own consultancy firm. It's called Social Media for Good, and he's going to be speaking to us about disaster response in a connected world. Please, Timo.
Well, thank you very much, and also thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. The topic of this conference, or the theme of this conference, is also communities, and I will speak very much about something that is very community-based, which is disaster response. Because at the end of the day, whenever there is a natural disaster or a conflict, the people who first come together to help each other is the local community. And I want to give you a bit of an overview of how connectivity in particular has helped to improve the work that we are doing in the field. Just very briefly about me, as Nicole said, I'm the founder of Social Media for Good, a small consultancy. My role is normally to advise humanitarian organizations like the UN, Red Cross and Red Crescent societies and NGOs how to better use technology in disaster response operations. And I normally or frequently do that actually in the field. For example, in Haiti after the earthquake, I was in Liberia, Philippines, Mali, Myanmar. And actually at the moment, as of 2 weeks ago, I'm in the other role where I'm actually the one doing the remote support for people in the field. And in this case, it's for the Nepal response. So I'd like to take a step back and look a little bit at how has ICT changed the way we interact with the world. And of course, for this audience, you're all very, very much aware of how this has happened in so many ways. But one image that I always like to use to illustrate this very well is this one here. What you see there is actually the same event 8 years apart. In the first case, it's the election of Pope Benedict. In the second, it's the election of Pope Francis, just 8 years apart. And as you can see in the top photo, you have one feature phone over there on the right, and in the bottom one, oh, now the sound is completely gone. Maybe I just keep on talking. Is it coming back? Yes, it's coming back. Oh, this is much better. So what you see in the bottom one is, of course, you see smartphones, you see tablets everywhere. And this increase in mobile connectivity is also what has been instrumental for changes in disaster response. You might have heard these numbers. You want to have another one? I can just use that. It feels like getting dressed while you're a mom. All right. Okay. We'll try that. I actually put this away a little bit. Or do you need this for pickup? Okay. You might have heard these numbers, which is we have 3.7 billion mobile phone users around the world at the moment. And this translates into roughly more than 7 billion mobile phone subscriptions. So, you would think that giving those numbers, there are a lot of people in the world, who obviously have access to connectivity. And one of the things that we are frequently debating when talking about the use of technology in disaster response is, do people really have access to the technology that we need them to have access to? And there's a common misconception that, for example, people in developing countries don't have smartphones. However, when we look at today's numbers, we see that 2/3 of all smartphones today are already in the developing world. And of course, with a smartphone, I can create much richer data sets with which I then can do more interesting things to support the response. Now, a smartphone in itself is not going to be very smart if it doesn't have connectivity. And this is where we still see the rub. As you can see in this chart, in the developed world, about 84 out of every 100 have a mobile broadband subscription, which means 3G or higher. But in the developing world, this is only about 21. So we clearly have still a very big gap there. And we need to address that when looking at in which situations are we, is it an urban disaster, is it a rural disaster, what kind of response is it? Why I think this glass is not half empty, but why I think this glass is half full is because of urbanization. Urbanization is happening globally, and it's happening rapidly. As you can see on this chart here, we are just a little bit beyond the vertical line, which actually means that today the majority of the world's population already lives in urban areas. And we know that as we see bigger urban centers, we will also see more disasters in urban areas in the coming years, which I think is also why addressing these ways of using technology to better assist communities affected by disasters is so important, because it's getting more and more. And of course, urban areas, they have more and better access to ICT infrastructure than rural areas. This is simply, there are many people here from the private sector, you all know that it makes more sense economically to invest in these areas. And while Africa and Asia actually still mostly rural, but they're also the regions with the fastest urban growth rates. Asia, by the way, is the region with the largest number of natural disasters per year. And just speaking personally, from the Nepal response at the moment, we really see the difference between urban and rural areas there quite clearly, because we get a lot of updates, for example, from Kathmandu, which is one of the handful of cities in Nepal that have 3G, but we get very little information from rural areas. So this is also something that we really have to be aware of when thinking about these things. But all things together, the use of ICT by disaster-affected population definitely grows. Now, what are the implications of this for disaster response? There are three. The first is information flows more quickly and more people have access to more information. The second is people can support the response remotely. And the third is that coordination centers become coordination networks. And all these three things really have a significant impact on how we are starting to change how we run disaster response programs. I'm going to start with the first one. Information flows more quickly and more people have access to information. Now, I look very much at social media, not only, but it's kind of my specialty. And a lot of times people say, like, well, social media, it's not really useful, because, what do people use social media for? Well, and let's be honest, most of us use social media to post a selfie when we're out on a Sunday, to take a photo of our breakfast, to take a photo of our cat, and to take a photo of the baby. Now, none of these things are very useful for disaster response. But of course, this is what people do with social media when everything is normal. When a disaster happens, normal changes. And there's no reason to think, why should people continue to use this tool the same way when a disaster happens as if, on a normal Sunday afternoon? And they don't. So let's look at how people use social media in emergencies. Well, you still have people taking selfies, which can be a little hard to understand, but they obviously do. It seems to be a very strong drive. But many people also just take photos of what they see. This is, again, these are images from Nepal. And this, of course, is something, as a disaster responder, when I have access to these images, I can see what the situation is on the ground. This kind of images is actually particularly interesting after storms, because a lot of people think like, well, why don't you just use satellite images for that? The problem is, when you have a storm, you have clouds, and your satellite images don't get through. So with images like that, we get a very, very, very quick overview, and it's of course not a comprehensive overview, but we get a glimpse of what's happening on the ground. Other things we always see is immediately is a posting of needs. Somebody says like, there's a family in this area, they need something. We also see the opposite, where people are saying, I have a resource, in this case transportation, with which I can assist, contact me. And we have almost immediately coming up community-based initiatives, like this one, where they just say like, okay, let's all get together tomorrow, let's meet there, and let's clean up. In this case, it's about garbage and human waste that needs to be disposed. So what you see is people are posting things that help situational awareness, they're posting needs, they're posting resources, and they're using it to coordinate. And they're doing it at a very, very significant volume. We're not talking about like 50 or 100 tweets or social media updates. In the Philippines, after Typhoon Haiyan, we saw close to 24,000 mentions per hour of the typhoon. In the US, after Hurricane Sandy, there were more than 20 million social media updates that referenced the storm. That was over 5 days. And 25% of these were photos and videos. And in Nepal, we saw 2 million mentions of either Nepal quake or Nepal earthquake in the first 2 days. Now, if you're the one who is charged with processing all that information and feeding that into the decision-making process, then you probably very quickly look like this. Because it is just too much information to process. In response, 3 different approaches have been adopted to deal with that. The first one is to train the potentially affected people. The Philippines government is doing this very, very well. They include in every communication that they issue as part of their disaster preparedness activities, hashtags asking people to use that when they talk about their needs. The Philippines is a highly connected country where people are using these things very much. And so they're saying, okay, if you are on the roof and the water is rising and you want somebody to get you from that roof, then please use rescue PH at the end. If you are in an evacuation center and you want to tell us you really need blankets and buckets, please use relief PH at the end. And also important, if you are safe and we can take this out of our database, please use safe now, and so forth. Now, of course, this makes it easier for people to manually find the information that is needed for the response. But of course, that is very hard to communicate to the affected people, particularly when you're under a lot of stress. If you are sitting on top of a roof and the water is rising, you probably have problems remembering a specific hashtag. And of course, this will miss significant parts of the conversation. So the next step is to use volunteers. And this is also kind of the first instance of remote support that I'll get into more detail in the next part. What you do here is that you extract all social media updates with specific keywords and you put them in a nice interface like that and you show them to volunteers all around the world and you ask them to classify those messages. For example, what you see there, is this a request for help? Is this infrastructure damage? Is this something else? And people, large crowds of people, can go through that information very, very quickly. But of course, it's still dependent on search parameters, and how quickly you can get through that depends on the size of your crowd. If you have 24,000 updates per hour, you need a pretty big crowd to do that. Advantage is it's very easy to set up, and these are free and open source tools, so that is something that we also very much like in the disaster response community. The third approach, and this is what we're seeing more now, and I think this is also where the future will be, is to basically use the spare or the scarce time of the volunteers not to go through 24,000 updates per hour, but to use their resources and their time to train artificial intelligence algorithms who then can go through all these updates. Essentially what you see here is pretty much the same interface you saw on the last slide, but with one important difference. When a volunteer tags something here as, for example, being related to shelter and supplies or to infrastructure, you have an artificial intelligence algorithm more or less looking over their shoulder and learning how they make those decisions. Then after time, you can let the algorithm loose, and the algorithm will go over the whole big data set of millions of messages and categorize them according to your needs. I think this is very promising because, of course, this is going to be much, much faster once it has been trained. And it's least dependent on keywords once the software has learned patterns. The next step of this is actually machine learning to recognize things on images. For example, you use volunteers to identify destroyed houses on buildings, let's say in the Philippines, and then the algorithm goes over all the rest of the images to mark that, and that way you very quickly have an overview of the damage in the affected area. Now, what do you get out of that? Now, one is you see trends showing conversations about needs. This is actually a snapshot I took last night. What you see here is conversations, and I think this was shelter, and I guess you can tell when the earthquake was. So you see people talking about shelter, very little, then it goes up, and then it kind of slowly goes down to where we are today. So from that information, you cannot say, oh, all these people have shelter, but what you can say is people are talking less about shelter. And you can use that as information to think about, are the needs still the same as they were a month ago, or are they not? Particularly if you have a second graph where, for example, water needs would go up, which in Nepal they're not, but you can use this to just see trends, what are people talking about. The other thing you can do is you can use these things if you have georeferenced social media updates to help you more understand what does your damage look like and where should you prioritize your scarce resources. This is something from Vanuatu, which was hit by Cyclone Pam earlier this year, and you can see people very quickly use social media updates and put them on a map. They did that with images like this, and they were asked to say, do you see severe damage or do you see mild damage? Well, very quickly you had a map like that, which is all very nice. But when I look at a map like that, I'm actually most interested in that point, which is the point where I have no updates from. The reason is, when I look at that, I'm thinking, this is a bit odd, and I want to know what's going on there. Now, I don't know Vanuatu, and maybe that's just because there's nobody living there. But it could also be maybe the destruction on that island is so much more significant that nobody is communicating from there. So if I know what my normal is, and if I see different patterns across my area of operation, then I can very quickly say, well, maybe this is where I should send my one assessment team or my one helicopter that I can send somewhere for an assessment first. It's not going to replace assessing all these other things on the ground, but it might tell me, this is where I should go first. So what it does, it increases my situational awareness, and it helps ask the right questions before committing resources. We also found that this is particularly useful in secondary urban areas. Now, what I mean with that is, in the provincial capital, you frequently have, the governor is sitting there, his ministers are sitting there, all the really important people are sitting there anyhow. And the provincial capital is probably going to get a lot of assistance very quickly because that is where all the important people are. But the secondary urban centers, they frequently still have enough ICT infrastructure to communicate about their needs, but they don't have the conglomeration of politically important people to make that response happen very quickly. And these tools can help us to prioritize these areas better. This was the point of view from the disaster responders. Now I quickly want to talk about how it is from the point of view of people affected by disasters. We see that people use social media increasingly, and also first in disasters. And a lot of this actually comes out of Japan, out of the tsunami there in, was it 2011? One of the things is, of course, because it's instant information, it's much faster than official channels. Also, the official channels are sometimes not widely trusted. Again, in Japan, people did not necessarily trust the government with information about radiation, so they turned to social media. People are already familiar with the interface, so they don't have to learn a new tool, and they carry it in their pocket, which is very important. And of course, it is about people that they care about. And this is something I can't emphasize enough. When there is an emergency and your friends or your loved ones are in the area, the first thing before you're looking for water or shelter, anything like that, is you want to know, is my brother, my son, my daughter, my wife, are they okay? Which is also why I thought this was very interesting. This is, maybe some of you have seen this after the Nepal earthquake on Facebook. Facebook pushed out, this is actually a dormant feature that we all have in our Facebook accounts. Facebook, of course, always knows where you are. And when they detect that there is a natural disaster where you are, then they will ask you, are you okay? We think you are, in an earthquake area or somewhere affected by a tornado or whatever. And then you can mark yourself as safe. This information is then immediately shared with your whole social network. What that means is, they all know that you're okay. And as a result, for example, maybe your spouse is not going to rush downtown where you are at the office, but he is going to stay at home and wait for you to get there, which might be the safer decision. It also means that your friends are not going to pick up the phone and try to call you every 5 seconds to ask you whether you're okay, which would put additional strain on the infrastructure. And we've all heard these things about like telecommunications breaking down, data still working. So this can really reduce the burden on the infrastructure we all have to use. Now, for the second part, which is how can people support the response remotely? What you see here is a mapathon, which is a couple of people together producing maps for an emergency. This is the British Red Cross here. Now, what they do is they use something called OpenStreetMap, and I'm assuming that many people in this room have actually heard of OpenStreetMap, which is a little bit like the Wikipedia of maps, which means everybody can go in, edit something, say, oh, this building is a school, this building is a police station, whatever. And we have a group of people which is called the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team that specifically works around disasters. And if you're interested in that, actually, I'll invite you to go to Missing Maps, which is a great project that looks particularly at areas that are regularly affected by disasters and to improve the maps we have there. The reason maps are so important is because we all take them for granted, but in a lot of places that are affected by disasters, we don't have maps. This is an example from the Ebola response last year. This was the map that a large international NGO had of, I think this is a whole prefecture, so this is basically a whole state of southern Guinea. Trying to organize a response with a map like that is very difficult. Now, they brought in a geographic information services technician who was like, well, we can do better than this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to access remote communities who can help us do this better. And he approached the OpenStreetMap people. When he started this process, this is what the area looked at around the biggest city in the prefecture. Not very useful. This is what it looked like 14 hours later. And this is how it was done. He used a satellite uplink to connect the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. They then they mobilized volunteers and very quickly got satellite images. They then per hand drew polygons on those satellite images to show where the houses are. And then basically within 14 hours you had this map that I showed you. Now, the second step is what I thought was essential and a little special about this. You have a lot of times remote support in isolation. What you had here was the GIS officer then sent out his own staff on motorbikes to all these villages to make sure that they knew what these little squares were that people had drawn on the map. Are they a school? Are they a hospital? Is it a police station? Is it something else? And that way, the virtual support that the team was able to get through the satellite uplink that they had, and it was a pretty slow satellite uplink, immediately helped them to enrich their informational products and to support the response locally. Here's a second example of how to use virtual support. Now, and I know nothing is more boring than putting up an Excel sheet on a slide, but what you see there, it's from Nepal, is a list of 513 organizations that were responding to the earthquake. And this was created by 75 online volunteers. Now, you might think that when there's a disaster, that everybody goes to the government or that everybody goes to, I don't know, the UN and says, oh, I'm organization X and I'm going to work providing shelter or medical supply in this area or in that area. That does not happen. People should do that, but in reality, you have 500 organizations that just show up, start working, and maybe 25 of them tell somebody else what they're doing and where they are. So having a list like that is worth gold from a coordination point of view. How did they get that information? You had these 75 volunteers who manually went through social media updates, press releases, and everything, because the same organization that does not tell the government they're going to work there, they're still going to send out a press release and a tweet. And then this list, after it was created, was made available publicly, which is great because it creates it's not just a coordination tool, but it also increases transparency and accountability. For example, if you're the mayor of a town, you can look into this list and you might be able to see you have 5 organizations working in your town. You have no idea they're there, but now you have a contact information which is also in that list, and you can go to them and say like, hi, I'm the mayor of this town, can we please talk about what you're doing in my city so that you're actually meeting the needs of the people here, because I live here and I probably know better what the needs are than you thought before you were coming here. So these things are super important, and they're not very sexy, but they're really, really helpful. With that, I'm coming to the third part, which is how coordination centers are becoming coordination networks. Now, I talked a lot about that people publish information on social media, like when I showed the thing from the Facebook safety check. I think one thing to remember is that the place where information is made available also becomes the place for coordination. Now, it used to be that information was available at the town hall. So you went to the town hall, and then everybody was there, and you found out here are the lists of people, that have been rescued. Here is the list of emergency shelters, all that kind of thing. And then you started to coordinate there. And by coordination, I also mean affected people. Everybody who is affected by a disaster is also coordinating, because that person is coordinating his own recovery. Now, with social media, this is changing, because the best place to find information is no longer in the town hall, but it might be on Facebook. And this means we have to change how we are thinking about coordination. Just to give you an example, in Germany we had big floods in 2013, and there were very quickly Facebook groups that talked about needs and also resources available to fill those needs. And a study found that 60% of all the posts that went up there were actually about local needs and the local means to fill those needs. This is extremely positive because it means there is a whole amount of, well, resources there of people who can just help each other. At the end of the day, we all know the community is the one who are mainly helping each other. And they're able to do this at a very granular level. I'm going back to this tweet I showed earlier, where somebody said, like, well, we need food, clothes, money, whatever, you know, in these locations. Now, when big organizations respond to a disaster, they don't do it at an individual level, but they just say, like, well, you know what, there are 100,000 people affected, which means we probably need 40,000 plastic tarps. Now, whether an individual family actually needs a plastic tarp or not is not really relevant in that calculation, because it's based on experience. And there are good reasons to do it like that. But this level of coordination by the affected people for the affected people can help with addressing other needs that the big systems cannot meet. Now, there's also a problem with that, because these are systems that disaster responders are not used to. They are new. They don't happen in the official designated meetings, but in virtual communities. So what that means is there is a lack of coordination between the formal disaster responders and these individual groups that are just supporting each other, which can lead to duplication and wasted resources. Now, of course, you know, helping each other is still very, very positive, but it's just something to keep in mind. And I have an example here, again from Germany, which was when we had those floods, we had people organize themselves to stack sandbags. Because they were like, well, the water is rising, everybody's stacking sandbags, here's a Facebook group, let's fill sandbags. And they went there, and they did that. And then after a while, somebody came by from the German technical service, and he looked at the sandbag barrier, and then he asked people, it's like, what are you doing here? And they were like, well, we're filling sandbags because the water is rising, and this is very good, and we've organized ourselves. And he's like, yeah, but I'm terribly sorry to tell you that, but you're doing it all wrong. So when the water comes, this is not going to be stable, and you're also doing it at the wrong location. So, of course, you know, they were very disappointed. They had invested all the time and energy to do this, but because the effort was not properly coordinated, that time was wasted. And, you know, the bags then had to be brought somewhere else, and so forth and so forth. So if we were able to connect these two systems that are currently not talking to each other, we would be in a much better position. And that actually gets me to my last slide, and the key points, which I hope you'll be able to take away from this, which is one, the use of ICT in disaster response, and particularly in disaster-prone countries, is growing rapidly, and particularly in urban areas. Social media can already inform concrete operational decisions and or mobilize operational resources. So this can be both the community-to-community thing, but it can also be the virtual support that you bring into a response. Nevertheless, we still have to be aware of the lack of connectivity we have in many rural areas. So this is definitely not something that you can use anywhere. You have to be, like with any tool, you have to be specific about where you're using it. And at the moment, this is mainly in urban areas. And as disaster responders, we need to start to integrate social media and leverage crowdsourcing and all these other things to increase situational awareness, coordination, and information management. And last but not least, and I think, you know, for many of you who have seen this, maybe some of you think like, oh, this is really interesting and maybe I can get involved in this. I think there's a large role to play in this for the private sector and also for academia, for improving some of the tools I showed. Like many of those tools were not, I think except for one, they were not commercial tools, but they were the result of research done and that are being made available. And if private sector and if academia talk to disaster responders about what the needs are and how can we help you to, you know, assist you with a response like that, and ideally have that conversation before a disaster, not during a disaster, then I think you have a lot to contribute, and that will help us, you know, respond even better and, you know, respond with even more appropriate means. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Timo. Do we have any questions for Timo? Yes, we got a microphone here, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really, really interesting. I'm Daniel from the Portuguese Web Archive, and I found really interesting that social media can be used and web information can be used to respond to disasters. But this information appears and disappears really quickly from the web. So my question is, how do you think that information, online information from past disasters, can be useful to help in future disasters?
Yeah, one of the things, some of the, and that is actually mainly then the commercial providers, are able to give you, for example, social media data back years. One thing we're actually doing at the moment in Nepal, and this is a very new project that I've only been involved in for the last 2 weeks. In Nepal, for example, we're now entering the monsoon season. And the assumption is that because of the earthquake, a lot of the mountains have gotten a little loose. So we are expecting a lot of landslides. So what we want to do is we want to compare the needs that people talk about to what it was before. But it doesn't make sense to compare it before what I showed there before the earthquake, because what you need to compare is you need to compare needs in the same season. This is particularly relevant for waterborne diseases. Like in the dry season, you don't really have a problem with waterborne diseases. In the wet season, you do. So what you basically do is you, for this long-term comparison, you go back to commercial providers to give you the data set for your query for the last year or even for the last 3 years if you want, and then you can overlay the trends, and then you cannot just see, oh, this is more compared to what we had before the rapid onset emergency, but this is actually twice as much as we saw last year. And then you can send a team in and you can look at, is this because we now had an emergency that made the situation worse, or is this due to other reasons? But for that data, actually at the moment, I agree with you, it's very difficult to get this long data, and the only way to do it at the moment that I have seen is through commercial providers.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Yes, we have one just here, please.
So you showed us quite a lot of tools that are being used to coordinate disaster response, but it seems that there needs to be coordination of the tools. Is there anything that kind of brings them together to say this is what we actually need tools to do?
The magic tool that combines them all?
Exactly.
No. That's the short answer. I think at the moment we still a lot of, it's also for disaster responders, it's still kind of a very new field, so you see a lot of initiatives that are doing that. You do start to see some research institutes like the Qatar Research Institute that are leading a little bit here, and then you start to see more things go around their tools. Personally, what I think would be great is to have a good open source information sharing platform. There is actually something that the UN released last year. It's called HDX. And that is, it's basically a data repository. It's a sort of XML where all the data from other resources can be structured so that it's easier to put into people's own systems. Because I don't think it's so much a question of having one tool. I think it's really of having data that can be interchanged between the different tools. The problem with that is a lot of organizations still have their own proprietary standards. And a lot of organizations can also be very jealous of the data. So that's a challenge. I think the way to go there is actually through the donors. You have big institutional donors like USAID or DFID and so forth, who, when they give big grants to organizations, can also make certain reporting requirements. And what we have seen in 1 or 2 cases is a donor saying, and you need to be able to publish your data using that format. And once you start to get that, then you start to have the ways to exchange data across platforms. What I also think is the most important about that, and that's why we won't see a universal tool, is the most important system this data needs to work with is the national government's system. And you will never have control over what that will be. But ultimately, they are the ones who should own that data and be able to do something with that, because they're in charge. And I think going through these standards and slowly pushing organizations to publish according to these open standards is the right way to go there. But to be honest, it'll probably take another 5 to 10 years until we're there.
Thank you. And we have one question over here, please.
Hi, Mark O'Leary from JISC. Thank you for a fascinating talk. It occurs to me that the academic community contains a lot of the expertise you've referred to, from geographers, technologists, whatever it may be. You currently have a captive audience of people from MRENs. Is there any role that you would ask us to particularly perform in coordinating or organizing, hooking up that expertise in academia with the response groups you've referred to?
I think we have a very also diverse group here, and I think, if there's something you saw the way I think like, oh, I can contribute to that, then by all means contact me. But particularly when we're talking also, about connectivity, I think connectivity is a huge factor. I was actually quite impressed with the team who were in Guinea and who were able to get all the remote support for OpenStreetMap, through that. But at the same time, they still had to get, some of the base layers for the maps, like basically on a CD that somebody had to take in the luggage to bring it there. So I think, some means of helping to improve connectivity both locally and for the remote support can be very important. I remember, for example, when I was in Liberia, I had an Excel sheet which was about 1.5 megabytes, so really nothing. But the only way I could get that to another organization that was an hour away from me, because the satellite connection was just so bad, I had to send a driver with that data. That was the only way I could get it there. So, yeah, I think connectivity definitely helps. And there are, of course, big players, particularly with satellite uplinks, and most of the organizations are already talking with them. But if there's a magic bullet there, I think we would all very much appreciate that.
Thank you, Tim. I think we're going to have to make that the last question, but thank you very much for a really very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
So moving on to our second speaker, I'm really pleased to welcome to the stage Avis Yates-Rivers. Avis is the president and CEO of Technology's Concepts Group. You may have seen her join me for a panel earlier on this week to talk about the role of women in ICT and in the IT industry, and she'll be talking to us more today about unconscious bias in our environment. Thank you very much, Avis.
Bon dia. Okay, is anyone here but me? Good morning, everybody. I am so thrilled about being here with you all today. I appreciate the invitation to come and share in this delightful and important gathering. I've been here for the last several days and have sat in on some really amazing sessions. And so I just want to thank Jean and all of those who are responsible in including me in the program. I think this conversation we're going to have this morning is a very important one. And what I want to do is just give you a little bit of background. You hear that I'm the CEO of Technology Concepts Group, but what you may not know is that Technology Concepts Group, or TCGI, is the 5th technology company that I have founded and run, and just celebrated my 30th anniversary of a tech CEO in January of this year. And throughout those 30 years, there have been relatively few if any, role models for folks like me who had left corporate America and decided to branch out on their own. And so it became very apparent to me that there aren't enough women even in the entrepreneurial space when it comes to technology. And so about 10, 11 years ago, NC WIT came knocking on the door. Can I see by a show of hands how many of you are familiar with NC WIT, or the National Center of Women and Information Technology? I see 4. Okay, but there are several of you in the audience who are members of NC WIT, or your organizations are members of NC WIT. So the National Center of Women in IT is based at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and what its mission is to significantly increase the role or the participation of girls and women and people of color in the invention of technology. And this organization, which is a nonprofit, a 501c3 in the US, was actually founded and started by the National Science Foundation because the government began to recognize that we're not going to be able to fill all of the new jobs, technology jobs, that US corporations are creating. And in fact, the statistics show that given the current rate of students in college pursuing computing or technology degrees, that number is about 1/3 of what we actually need to fill all of the net new technology jobs that US corporations and corporations around the world are creating. And so what can we do about it? How did we get into this problem, and what can we do about it? And so that's who NC WIT is, and I serve as a member of the board of directors. I also serve as their national spokesperson for their outreach campaign called Sit With Me. And so I want to talk a little bit today about what is the problem around unconscious bias or the lack of diversity in tech. What is it? What can we do about it? Why does it persist? And what does the research say? You see, NC WIT is a research organization, and that's what the federal government pays for. And that research has produced hundreds and hundreds of products and resources that are available to the world for free, and I'll tell you how you can get your hands on them. And so let's move on. I mean, we've been hearing a lot about unconscious bias lately in the media, and this is especially true as it relates to women and people of color. And companies are recognizing that to be successful, they have to diversify their tech workforce. But first, they have to understand why these groups are missing in the first place. So first, let's make sure we understand what I mean when I talk about unconscious bias, because it is also known as implicit bias, which refers to the attitudes or the stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. And this, in turn, affects how we react to people or treat people. So as you can imagine, conscious bias is easy to spot. Unconscious bias, not so much. When conscious bias exists, behaviors are negative and they're hurtful. And we have many examples of this in modern history. But unconscious bias, as you can imagine, is more stealth. It's harder to recognize, and it's even more difficult to thwart. Prevailing stereotypes portrayed in the media or learned through past experiences can be triggered by events and operate without conscious intention. For an example, a common stereotype in the tech industry is that men are better suited for these jobs due to their aptitude in math, and that girls are not good at math. And so if we take a look at the facts here, we see that women comprise over half of the US professional occupations, and that we hold only 25% of US technology jobs, and that women only are coding or developing new software at 19%, and only 5% hold leadership jobs in technology. Think CTO. R&D of product development, or R&D of technology. And then if we drill down a little bit further, when it comes to people of color, Blacks and Hispanics professionals comprise 16% of the U.S. professional occupation, but almost a third of the population. And Black and Hispanic men hold 9% of computing jobs. Black and Latinas women hold only 4%. And so when you look at these statistics, and you drill down even further into that stereotype, white and Asian males are considered the best candidates, borne out by the fact that that is what we see in the media on a daily basis. And so it has developed into a bias that's commonly held today. Now, the thing about it is that we are all biased. It's not that men are biased, it's that we are all biased. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about why we are biased when it comes to gender and technology. So as not to leave you out, I did take a look into an international database to see how you're faring over here in Europe. And outside of a good one in the Czech Republic or a very low one in Turkey, all the major countries are pretty much banded together in the same levels of women holding technology jobs. So what's also important is the fact that the little bit of technology that we do have in corporate jobs are leaving. We find that in a study that women leave 56% of the time a tech job due to an unwelcoming environment. And that's twice the quit rate of men. So what hard work that we're putting out to get diversity into the workplace, it's leaving way too often. And this slide tells you that 2 million people a year, male and female, leave U.S. companies due solely to perceived unconscious bias. So that's a brain drain there. And when we look specifically at women, 74% of women surveyed said that they love the work that they're doing, yet they're leaving 56% of the time. And contrary to popular belief, they're not leaving the workplace. They're staying in the workforce. They're just leaving that unwelcoming environment. So why? So what? Why does it matter? It matters for a number of reasons, and I'll talk a little bit about each one. But firstly, it's common knowledge that women make a preponderance of purchasing decisions around the world. And so women are predominantly your customers, and women spend their money very wisely. I know that when it comes to spending the money that I have available to spend, I'm very conscious of the companies with whom I spend that money, as are women all over the world. And let's look at a little bit more deeply into some of the benefits that diversity drives. We know that when women are in leadership positions, and people of color are there as well, that companies have experienced increased sales revenue, more customers, a bigger market share. They are enjoying higher than average profitability and a greater return on their shareholder equity. And there's a greater potential for creativity. And when you're in the tech industry, creativity and innovation is key. We also know that diversity enhances teams. Groups with greater diversity solve complex problems better and faster than homogeneous groups. Women also improve innovation. And this was a study where a couple of the authors set out to understand what makes a group's collective intelligence rise. And it was the greatest predictor was the number of women on the team. The more women on the team, the higher the collective intelligence of the group. And it wasn't so much that individual rock star or individual contributor. It was actually the number of women. And I've got all of these studies on these slides for you when you download this presentation. Please feel free to go into all of these studies. We also know that in the venture world, when we reviewed and analyzed more than 20,000 venture-backed companies, it showed that successful startups had twice as many women in senior positions as unsuccessful companies, and that these companies that are led by women grew a lot faster using a lot less capital typically 30 to 50% less capital when they launched, but they grew faster and was able to make that transition from startup to established company. So, a lot of data. I'm not going to go through it all, just a quick little run through some of it for you to help you understand why the problem persists and what are some of the things we can do about it. So it's important to look at the intersectionality of multiple biases. You know, it's not just gender, it's age, it's race, it's sexuality, it's weight. It's a lot of things that when you look at someone like me, for example, who's doubly blessed to be born African American and female, you know, there's intersectionality along both of those biases. So it's important to, again, recognize that minority groups aren't broken. And NCWIT is not a women's organization because too often these organizations want to fix broken technical women. Women are not broken, no minority groups are broken. And it's also important for me to point out that majority groups are not the enemy, in this case, men and technology. But the culprit is societal bias, and we are all biased, as I mentioned before, but we can all take action to fix this problem together. So early on is a good place to start. So for all young or startup technology companies, NCWIT also helps you to get your culture right from the beginning, because it's much easier to create on a clean slate. So when I talked about us all being biased, this is the results of the Project Implicit study that you can all take online. What this one shows is the percentage of respondents that have a natural attribution of men in science, and at the bottom, women in science or women in liberal arts. And so the preponderance of these survey respondents, male and female, 72% when you combine all of the top ones together, automatically associate men in science and women in liberal arts. Project Implicit has several studies that you can take online. Again, these are some of those intersectionalities, disabilities, Asian, race, weight, age. All of these are studies and surveys that you can take online. So what causes societal bias, or what causes us to think that men are better suited for technology than women? The answer is schemas. And I don't have to explain that to this body of researchers and people in this space, but our mind has to create shortcuts. We can't possibly process all of the information that we are being bombarded with, images, social media, television, media, all different types of images that are coming to us on a daily basis. So we make shortcuts, but oftentimes we misinterpret those shortcuts, and that's called unconscious bias. So I'll talk a little bit now about bias in hiring and promotion. Recent resume surveys show that white resumes receive 50% more callbacks than black resumes or any other ethnic-sounding named resumes. You're probably wondering how they know they're white. Well, they don't sound black, or they don't sound Asian or Hispanic or anything else, the name. And so what some companies do is they strip away the names and they just number the resumes, and they receive a much better response. Black applicants needed 8 years more experience than similar non-black applicants, and that the higher quality resume equaled a larger increase in callbacks for whites. And we look, how many of you have heard of the Roizen study conducted by Associate Professor Frank Flynn from the Columbia Business School? What he did was he took the CV of Heidi Roizen, very, very successful venture capitalist in technology in Silicon Valley, very successful woman. And he told half of his class of male and female students before he handed them out that this was Howard Roizen's CV. The rest of the half got Heidi's CV. And then he began to ask 3 questions. This is the first one. How power-hungry, self-promoting, and disingenuous was Roizen? Negative characteristics. Heidi scored much higher in this question. Second question, how competent and effective was Roizen? Positive characteristics. Howard scored much better. And these were statistically significant differences. Third and last question, would you like, hire, or like to emulate Roizen? Howard scored much better. Again, positive characteristics. Same CV, actually a woman. And so we know that unconscious bias is more salient in homogeneous organizations as a result of society and schemas that are taking place there. Another interesting unconscious bias is called stereotype threat. And an example of this study was that white male engineering students were told in advance that Asians typically score higher on math tests, and then the white male students didn't score as well when they were told that. Stereotype threat, unconsciously pervasive during testing. And this is how unconscious bias and stereotype threats show up in technical environments. And again, it's not just women, it's any underrepresented group or individual who's typically the only one in an otherwise homogeneous environment. They won't speak up at meetings. They won't, or they will be reluctant to take on leadership positions. Overly harsh about their work is something that women have as a trait as well, or tending to discount their work. When asked about their success, they'll attribute it to the team. When asked a male about the success, yeah, I nailed it. So that's just the way we're wired. And this is how it shows up in technical environments. Again, micro inequities, another form of unconscious bias. You know, just subtle missteps and mistakes. Oops, I forgot to CC her on that email about architecture review. You think she'd be interested in that? Do you think if I invest, people will think I'm gay? You just need to be more professional. That's all. So these are the kinds of things that are actually said in work environments. So there are many institutional barriers, because especially in the US, most of our major corporations were created, again, think about the history, by white men for white men many years ago, a lot of them. And so they were created for a homogeneous environment. Oftentimes, the recruiting is selecting people like me, if I'm doing the recruiting. Or that women tend to find themselves in lower value type jobs. Not that project management or business analysis is not important, but women are overpopulated in those types of roles as opposed to the true production roles. And take a look at your performance appraisals and job want ads. We'll talk a little bit about that as well as the criteria for promotion. You know, once women are in the workplace, a good way to keep them from leaving is to make sure that we value their contributions. Here's another study that was done, an example of bias in hiring. It was a true audition for an orchestra, and the candidates were asked to remove their shoes to walk across the stage and play their instruments. No stilettos, no heels clicking, you couldn't really tell who that was behind the curtain. And as a result of that blind audition, the number of women went to almost half of the orchestra because the hiring of them increased by 25%. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? There's a lot of things that we can do, and a lot of things that NCWIT has studied and produced hundreds of resources on these topics, and they're all available to you. A couple of things not to do, though. First, don't lower your hiring standards. That's not necessary. Just make sure that you're hiring for the things that do matter, not for the things that you may have hired for always. Don't slap a boilerplate diversity statement on your job ads, things like, women and minorities are encouraged to apply. because what that does is it signals that diversity may be a problem, or that you're just trying to fill some quotas or some slots there. So don't do that. Don't form development teams with just one diverse engineer. That's not really going to produce the results that you think, because of what we just looked at. When you're the only one there, you won't really contribute. And don't depend on your underrepresented employees to advance your diversity goals. You know, let's form a diversity team. Tag, you're it. Let's go out and make it happen. Instead, use some of the resources that are available to you. Some things to do: invite diversity, embrace diversity, and recruit for it. Remove that biased language from your job descriptions. We just saw this slide, but now we're looking for an aggressive, hard-driving rock star or a world-class coder. You have to remove those kinds of languages from your job ads. We also, not we, but NCWIT researchers also assist their corporate members in auditing not just their job ads, but their performance appraisal instruments. You'd be surprised how much gendered language there are on those documents. Evaluate your interview questions and include diverse representation in the process, right? And then again, hire and interview and ask questions for the things that matter, not complex logic puzzles, you know, that would trip people up. Audit your physical space for implicit bias, because the environment means a lot. This is where people are coming to work every day. And you just want to make sure that it's as welcoming as it possibly can be. Assure inclusive team meetings and social events. You know, don't leave anyone out. That might seem to be common knowledge or common practice, but again, these are things that are done unconsciously. And then provide recognition, credit, and encouragement. This happens to be the results of a study of engaged employees who overwhelmingly believe that their supervisors are really interested in their strengths. And so they are constantly providing that recognition, that positive feedback, that credit, and that encouragement. Because when you have engaged employees, they are less likely to leave. Also, you want to audit your performance review and advancement processes. I just mentioned that. These documents, which may have been around for quite some time, need to be reviewed, audited, and analyzed, and remove language from them that may not be attractive. And you want to also have very clear, defined paths to upward mobility. And all of these things I'm talking about today are good for women and men. You want to consciously develop your talent. Again, watch for biases in the way that you assign tasks or leadership positions. And now I want to talk a little bit about male advocates, because men are still in the majority of these roles. It's very, very important, men, if we're going to change the dynamics, that you become actively involved in the process. It's so important that Nancy Witt set out to study men just recently to understand better what makes a male advocate. And we see so many of them around the country. We wanted to understand, why are you advocating so strongly for technical women? You know, what are you doing? What's behind all of that? And some of the things that came out of the study was that men had either a personal and or professional encounter with women. On a professional side, they've had a female supervisor or boss in the past. On the personal side, their wife, mother, daughter, sister, you know, they have very strong relationships there, and they want to make sure that, you know, they are treating other women just as they are treating those women who are closest to them, or that some of those women in their family have achieved great success. And so they know that it is certainly something that all women can do. And so these are the top 10 ways that came out of the study to be a male advocate. And this resource is available on the NCWIT site. But most important, number one reason came out is listen to women. And we had one respondent to the survey who didn't realize what his boss had to go through until one day she just said, you know, no matter what I do, it's not good enough. And he was very surprised because he thought of her as a rock star, didn't know the background story at all about how she got there and what it took for her to stay there and even go further. So listen to women, and then talk to other men, especially if you see some things going on or some language going on, that you need to be the one to correct them. Work with women's groups, recruit more women, be more purposeful about it. Some hiring managers will not accept a slate of new candidates unless there's at least a balance of male and female and other diverse candidates on that slate. And if it takes longer to fill a role, so be it. But if they take that stance, then the folks who are doing the recruiting will come to respect that and won't approach them with anything less. Importantly, sponsor women, mentor women. And the difference between the two is mentoring is an active two-way relationship, whereas sponsorship means that you are doing something or for someone even when they're not in the room, especially for leadership roles and new assignments. And so those are the top 10 ways to be a male advocate. And there's many, many more pieces of information that I can share with you. But I've decided to just really focus today on the fact that we are in this together. We have to fix it together. NCWIT is one of those organizations that can support you. It is a U.S.-based organization because it's principally funded by the U.S. government, but there are some members of the member organizations in the audience. Many of the U.S. universities who are here are part of NCWIT's Academic Alliance. I've met some corporations who are here, and I see several member organizations of NCWIT's Workforce Alliance, Brocade. I've met Google and others who are here, members of NCWIT. So NCWIT is this community of change leader organizations in K-12, in higher education, in workforce, in entrepreneurial space, and in other areas as well. There are 5 total alliances making up a tremendous amount of people who are working in this space. Everything that they do is research-based, with a team of social scientists that do nothing but study this phenomenon and identify ways in which it can be thwarted. Because we do know that companies who are not rich in diversity are not going to experience the best financial returns. And so this is a business issue. This isn't a social issue. It's certainly not a women's issue. It's a business issue. And you're not going to be able to sustain any type of profitability at the levels that you'd like, even in a nonprofit situation, if you haven't embraced technology. And to quote one of my very dear friends in the U.S., we don't know how good technology can be until we all participate in its invention. So I encourage you not to give up. This is a long-distance race. It's taken years for us to get here. I don't know if you know this, but women used to occupy about 37% of U.S. technical positions back in the mid and late 80s. And now today, we're down to 25%. What happened? What did we do or not do as a discipline to allow this to happen? And it's increasingly more obvious with people of color. So let's get out there and run this race together. Here are some of those resources that I talked about, www.ncwit.org/resources. Hundreds, over 300 resources that are available to you. They are all evidence-backed. They are ready to be utilized by you. There's some of the different types of resources. We have programs in a box, which means that they're all there. All the templates, all the tools, all the products. I like to say just add water and stir, or brand it for your organization, and it's available for immediate use. Women in IT, the facts will give you a lot more information and data that I've shared with you this morning about just exactly where women are when it comes to IT. We have so that's an example of a report or a white paper. We have many similar ones. We have a girls in IT, because we know that if we don't get girls by middle school to really believe that they are good enough to take math and that they are smart enough and that they do belong there, we will lose them in middle school. So with our K-12 Alliance, when think of all of the organizations that touch girls, Girl Scouts, Girls Inc., Boys and Girls Club, 4-H. These are all of the big nonprofits in the U.S. that have programs for girls and boys. And through that K-12 Alliance, we touch every girl in the United States. And we have programs for middle school, high school, and college level women. And so these are some of the resources that are available to you. You can keyword search because they are voluminous, and you may want to hone in or zoom in on an area of particular interest to you. But I am so thankful to be here to share this information. I hope it's not my last time. I want to find out how I can be more of a resource to the Jaunt organization and to all of the individual entities that make up this organization. I thank you for having me, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you so much, Ava. That was a brilliant talk. I'm going to use chair's privilege and ask a question first, if that's okay with you. One of the things we often hear in our environment is that education and research and technology organisations in education and research work on a process of meritocracy, that everyone gets there by their own merit, and that any attempt to look at some of the issues around who's getting in, changes to support women and more diverse areas getting in, actually corrupts that concept of meritocracy. How would you respond if someone was to put that to you?
Well, you know, it's an interesting concept and one that we talk about all the time. And we do hear a lot of, you know, I made it, why can't you, type of thing. And, you know, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But what's important to realize is that there have been some barriers to entry in technology and in the workplace that date back many, many years. I was going to say millions of years. It feels like millions of years, but many years. And those are institutional barriers and things that have kept the underrepresented out of these scenarios for a very long time. And so it's not as if, and the effects of those barriers still exist. You know, when I think about our history, you know, as African Americans in the U.S., even though when you think about it, slavery just ended, you know, in my grandparents' lifetime or my great-grandparents' lifetime. And so there's so much more ground that had to be made up for us. And being common in certain positions just wasn't there. And we also understand that girls and women are looking at role models. You know, what are they going to aspire to? So if I come into your organization and I don't see any concept or any example of someone like me that can make it, I don't want to just come and do a job. You know, I want to excel. I want to rise. I want to have upward mobility. And there's no one there that can show me the way. And then it makes it even more difficult. This is a conversation that we can have all afternoon about meritocracy, but you know, we don't want to forget the fact that there is some serious barriers that have been placed out there which needs to overcome. Women aren't broken, we are smart enough, we just haven't had the opportunities. And certainly when you look at people of color, it's even more obvious that we haven't had those opportunities that we are just beginning to see.
Brilliant, thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? I think we've got one over here, please.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. My name is Iman. I'm from Sudan.
Yes.
From Open Internet Alliance also. My question is, what is the role should be played by women in executive position in technology? What is your message to those women to remove the barrier? And my second question is, what is the message you have for the girls who are still in secondary school and are interested in technology? Thank you.
Thank you, Imam. The responsibility of people in leadership roles is very simply, you have to be more cognizant and make diversity count. You have to be purposeful. It's not just going to happen by happenstance. You have to remove barriers. You have to sponsor women and people of color. You have to ensure that the responsibilities or the tasks and the path to leadership is clarified and made available to people of color. And sponsorship plays such a key role because those decisions on who to put in certain positions are not done in a public forum. They're usually done in a small group of decision makers. And if there's no one in that small group of decision makers who's saying, you know, I think Nicole is perfect for that new VP position, then it won't happen. It just won't happen because it will just continue to be more of the same. You know, they play golf or have dinner parties with each other, not with Nicole or Avis or Iman. And so if we're not in those circles, someone has to open the door. And someone in that leadership position who carries the respect and who can make that decision without being questioned. And as for girls, you know, that's why NCWIT created the Aspirations in Computing Awards. It was just a program to encourage high school girls to persist. You know, oftentimes they were the only one in their class. And, you know, they would sit in the back of the room with the answers, but not, you know, bothering to, you know, compete with the boys with the hands raising to answer the questions, but just making sure that they knew that someone was watching them and was going to do everything that we could do to encourage them. That program, which started with 30 applicants about 7 years ago, has had thousands of high school girls go through the program. And so we've actually created a technical pipeline of young, diverse women from all over the country. It's been so successful that Google actually encouraged and funded us to start a program in middle school, because that's where we're going to lose the girls if we don't encourage them at that time. And it's actually the high school girls that we fund to work with one of our academic alliance organizations to create after-school programs and summer camps and other activities in a near-peer relationship so that they can see themselves in high school. And then the high school girls can see themselves in college. And just last year, we created a college pathway for girls who did not know about the program in high school. And so we're trying to create this continuum of encouragement, support, funding, technology, togetherness. They're in a community all their own. And it's an amazing thing to watch these girls blossom, which we know they can do with the right environment.
Thank you very much. Any more questions, please? Yes, we have Ingrid just here.
Who has
please.
the microphone?
Sorry, they've got one at the back there already. Gosh, you're so far back.
For once, I'll beat Ingrid to it. I am actually mentoring two, I will not call them girls, but women, one of them of color. And you use the words, show them the way. And actually, I'm a little bit struggling with that because, and I'm of course grossly simplifying and stereotyping, etc. But a lot of the showing the way involves explaining to them how the male mind works in a way, I guess, and the male-dominated enterprise.
Yes.
So you are kind of teaching them how to be like a man, and that doesn't feel right. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you for that question, because you know, it's probably on the mind of other people. Let me just emphatically say, I am not teaching, I'm not asking you to train or teach women to be a man, to think like a man. They need to know the rules of engagement, and that's something that they may not get anywhere else. It's important when you're mentoring women that you recognize that it is mostly men who are going to be doing that mentoring, which is why we study men, to find out why. But the biggest thing that you can do for your women, your female mentees, is to listen to them. Ask them about their experiences. Understand what are some of the things that, you know, they go through, or what are some of the things that they want to do moving forward, and then you can help them navigate the organization, because that's what you know how to do, not change who they are. You know, we want the diversity of women's minds, the way we approach problem solving, the way we think. You know, we want that diversity to be a part of the organization and to be a part of the technology that's continuing to be invented. You know, if the technology today is as good as it is, and we are all dependent upon it, how much better could it be when you have the input of someone like me, not necessarily just because I'm African American and female, but that I'm one of 6 children who grew up to 2 working class parents in the Bronx of New York City, and had to be creative about, you know, everyday life, navigating the New York City subway system as a very young child, or the New York City public bus system, or public school system. You know, someone like me who, if I was going to go to college, it was that local community college, which it was for me. You know, so all of those experiences I bring to whatever environment I come to, or whatever product I'm developing or helping to develop. And so we certainly don't want to strip any of that away from the women that you are mentoring. Rather, help understanding it and then helping them to navigate. Does that help?
I think we've got time for one more, so I think we should give that to Ingrid.
No more. I shouldn't answer so long. I'm sorry. We can get more questions if I don't keep talking.
Hi, I'm Ingrid. I hold a Master in Telecommunication from the Norwegian Institute of Technology from 20 years ago. Well, a bit more than 20, but come on. All those years of study, and they gave me 1.5 pages on TCP/IP. And on that basis, I was hired by an NREN. And everyone in that research network had a different background. They came as building engineers who'd done construction. They came as physicists, mathematicians. We hired all kinds of people. And I know many of you from when I joined this community 20 years ago have very diverse backgrounds. And then the university finally started training people, you know, about the internet, the services, how to build stuff. And we loved them for it. And we started hiring those people. And most of them are male. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas about what professions we should raid to get more diversity back into our organizations. Information scientists, librarians come to mind, but are there other professions that we should sort of go systematically after to give us wider diversity?
Are you in a work environment or an academic environment? I couldn't tell.
I'm in a work environment.
Work environment.
Yeah.
And the question is how to attract more?
How to widen the diversity and not just have male programming, bandwidth-loving geeks. I love bandwidth geeks, by the way, but
Okay, and a lot of that I have gone through on how you can increase your recruiting. You know, you want to have diverse representation in that whole process, questioning, campus recruiting, however you do recruiting, you want to have diverse representation in there. You don't want to advertise that you're looking for diverse candidates because that's kind of a cue that you're in trouble or that you have some issues there. And you want to make sure that you're hiring for the things that matter, right? And as I mentioned before, several companies are just numbering resumes, so kind of making it a blind recruiting process, and also not being satisfied until your slate of candidates are equally diverse, gender and people of color. So those are just some of the quick things that I went over today. There are a lot more on the NCWIT resources site on how to recruit, attract, retain, and advance diverse candidates or diverse employees within your workforce. And so before Nicole gives the final
Thank you.
comments, I just want to let you know that I'd be happy to continue to support your efforts. Please stay in touch with me. I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, and my email address and Twitter handle. You're probably wondering why I want you to sit with me. But remember, my marketing and outreach campaign for NCWIT is called Sit With Me. And so I'm asking you to sit with me on Twitter. Thank you so much for having me. I truly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avis. And just very quickly to remind you that there is an informal BOF during lunch today to discuss this in a bit more detail. And if you look for Anne Harding or Catherine Stover, you will find everyone in the lunch area. So just remains for me to thank both of our speakers once again for a really, really good session, and to please remind you all to fill in those evaluation forms. And we look forward to spending a lot more time with you all today. Thank you very much.